This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 388, Valhalla Content Hub. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we are talking about Valhalla Content Hub with Shane Thomas. Shane is a staff product manager at Netlify, formerly an engineering manager, and product manager at Gatsby. He used to also run a website called codekarate.com. Shane, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
It's good to be back for what seems like maybe the half a dozen times or so that I've been here. It has been a while, so I'm happy to be back.
It's been a couple of years. I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Today, my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello.
And joining us for the next 4 weeks, Jacob Rockowitz, module maintainer at the Big Blue House. Jacob is the maintainer of the Webform module and now schema.org blueprints module for Drupal. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to all the topics that you have lined up for the next 4 weeks.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. I thought this week we would talk about the entity share module, which is really a collection of modules to syndicate content between Drupal websites. It was originally created in March of 2015. The current version is an 8.x-3.0-RC4, which was created in April of 2022. But the dev branch is actually D10 ready and has seen commits just in the past week. So it's very actively maintained, seemingly preparing for a release potentially. There are 42 open issues, 10 of which are bugs, and it's currently in use by almost 3,000 websites. The most active maintainer right now seems to be Grim Reaper, who is a maintainer of a list of his own modules, as well as being a frequent speaker and organizer of Drupal events in Europe. Now, digging into entity share a little bit more, it supports not just nodes, but also taxonomy terms, media, and other kinds of entities. You basically configure one site to be the server that provides out those entities, and you can specify sort of which content types or bundles will be available and in which languages. And then you would set up one or more other sites to be configured as clients, pointing at that server with the necessary authentication information. Client can also potentially pull from more than one entity server if necessary. Now, as part of the sync, it will also recursively import all referenced entities. And you can also sync additional revisions. So there's the ability then to even do sort of a visual diff between different revisions. So if you've got kind of local changes, you can compare those changes before importing them. There's a companion module, Entity Share Cron, to make the sync process scheduled. And there are also companion modules to use the web sub protocol for the sync. And there's a companion module as well for ECA integration. The project page also has links to presentations and blog articles that explain how the module works and how it is used if you're interested in sort of digging more into understanding the module. So let's open it up to talk about entity share.
I'm interested. Has anybody used this module like in a real world scenario?
No, I have not.
I haven't, but Martin, it's an interesting thing that you credit the maintainers, but it's also worth noting the supporting organizations because, John, you're asking that question. It's like Smile, an agency I haven't heard of, Lullabot, but Carnegie Mellon, and I cannot read the last. Actancy. Yeah, I'm dyslexic, so I will just struggle with that. But the hint here is that Carnegie Mellon's using it actively on their site and their properties, which is a good indication that it's being used at scale in a real world situation.
I wonder if it solves the content staging issue that a lot of bigger organizations have, where they want to stage the content in a dev environment and then not have to re-enter that content.
It does look like it was. So in deploy was probably the set of modules that people would have used in D7, and it looks like this being sort of available for modern versions of Drupal is kind of the successor to that.
Yeah, it does. It does solve that problem, Nick. From what I've read, I was telling Martin that I actually just got off a call talking about this module for a project that I'm working on. So I was just curious if anybody had used it and what their take on it was. But it does seem to help in moving content from staging to production and facilitating the process for that. So,
Yeah.
I was also going to add, I think it could also be useful in the environment where you have a bunch of related sites and maybe some of that content is shared or needs
Yeah.
to be shared. So I think the staging environment is probably the most common use case, but I could also see there are certain environments where you build content on one site, but you might need parts of that content or, parts of those entities to maybe be available on other sites as well.
Yeah, so I think one use case I've heard of, and I don't remember where I heard this of, was like shared taxonomy, where like somebody adds a taxonomy to one site and it needs to kind of like proliferate out to other sites. That's a interesting use case. So definitely something that once maybe one of us uses it, we can come and we could talk about it further and how it helped or hurt in that scenario.
I think the maybe one other thing that I'll add is that in addition to sort of that one-to-many way of content sharing, it looks like you can also use it to sort of many-to-many. So all sites sharing their content with each other as well.
It sounds like you could get an exciting recursion loop there as well, but you probably have to be a little more careful there. But yeah, or maybe use it as an aggregator, like if you have a many-to-one type situation too. So yeah, definitely interesting. Well, thank you, Martin. As always, an on-point module of the week for our topic this week. So we'll chat with you next week. Okay, so before we get to our primary topic, let's start with the big news. Gatsby is now part of Netlify. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, it's was kind of a big announcement in the last month or so where it came out and the news was made official. It's been a great experience so far. I think what we had started to realize, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk a little bit more about Valhalla, is that while we do, I'm a strong believer in Gatsby, the framework. I think it does a lot of things better than a lot of other frameworks, but there are certain cases where other frameworks do things better. And a lot of what we're doing in Gatsby was not just specific to the Gatsby framework, specifically with our data layer. And we really had started to think outside the box of just being a framework company with a cloud platform. And I think that was one of the things that really kind of brought us together with Netlify. And our visions were very well aligned as far as what we were both trying to do. Netlify obviously much more mature and a larger organization than Gatsby. So I think the visions are, we're all going to the same place. And I think we've realized that Netlify realized that, hey, we could maybe go faster if we go together.
Yeah. So complementary kind of vision and forward progress. That makes a lot of sense. How does this change things for Gatsby? Is Gatsby going to kind of like continue to operate as its own thing? Or is it more like when we say Gatsby now, it's going to be very specifically like the JS framework as opposed to the whole company?
Yeah. And so we actually last week we did a webinar with a few people at Netlify and I was on it. And we talked about what the future of, Gatsby is going to be, what the future of Netlify and, kind of how we're going to be working together. And I think, the main thing is Gatsby Cloud isn't going away anytime soon. That Gatsby Cloud, we have a lot of customers using it. It has some of the best features of Gatsby. I think what we're thinking about as we kind of merge in with Netlify is how do we bring some of those really specific Gatsby improvements to the Netlify platform. So, Netlify has a lot of customers that use Gatsby as well. So if we can provide ways to get some of the same performance improvements built on top of Netlify's already robust platform, it can be an even better win for kind of both sides. And then in the future, we'll kind of see what becomes of things. But I think that right now the plan is, we have Gatsby Cloud, we have Netlify. They're serving slightly different niches of audiences, but we want to make sure the best features are available within the Netlify platform.
So
cool.
Yeah. So the podcast is about Valhalla. I'm a dyslexic. Valhalla. the Content Hub. So we need, I posed the question of, we need to step back and say, what is a Content Hub? And Shane, like, kind of coming up with the definition. For me, I will say, when I think of Content Hub, I go back and forth between content repository, Content Hub, trying to distinguish the differences. And then also just stepping back is this, I guess we're going to get to, where does this product, the Valhalla Content Hub, fit into Gatsby and Netlify in that new space that's being created?
Yeah.
So let's go with Content Hub first. Sorry.
So Content Hub is a very broad term, and it can mean a lot of different things. And I'm going to share with this podcast something that's probably never been publicly shared. And John doesn't even know it. But John helped name Valhalla Content Hub.
Really?
Yeah.
I did.
You did.
Tell me more.
So we were on. So I as part of product, I interview a lot of different people, and I asked John, as we were kind of really developing the early stages of the product, what he thought, and he's like, "Oh," he made one comment. He's like, "Oh, it's kind of like a content hub," and that's when I was like, "Well, yeah, that's pretty much what it is." And so we had the name Valhalla, but we wanted to put a descriptor of what does Valhalla actually mean. And so John's comment of, "Oh, it's kind of like a content hub," actually became part of the name. So no one, that's never been announced publicly. I don't think anyone else now, besides whoever listens to this podcast, knows that was part of how we decided on the name Content Hub, at least being part of the official name.
Well, that's some pretty cool history. So I'm going to take Jacob's question and say, okay, John, what is a content hub, and how does a content hub differ from?
That's a good reader. Yeah.
As the expert.
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know. I think like terminology is hard, right? And it has different meanings to everybody. Like when I think of a content hub, like I think of it as more of like probably like a place with like tools that allow me to get to that content and share that content, right? When I think of a repository, I honestly just think of like a dumping ground for like, oh, I need to go into the repository to get like that old piece of content out, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think like, overall that when you're talking about a content hub, you're probably pushing that content out to different places. You have tools to be able to access the content and use it in different ways, right? A repository is really just a storage point.
Yeah.
Well,
that's how I look at it. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know.
But the term hub is a hub spoke model. So you have a central place and then you have the spokes, all the web properties. And if a repository is being accessed by only one spoke, it's definitely not a hub. But if you have 20 properties calling the repository to pull or push content into, you start getting to what we're calling a content hub, a place to centralized place for content, the hub.
Part of me really wonders that people that call things hubs, if they really actually know what Jacob just said, or if they just like, oh, this is cool, we're going to call it a hub because
yeah. And that's actually a great point, because in the way that we think about Valhalla, and we'll get into more of the details, but it really is bring content from multiple places and then consume that content in multiple, frameworks, or, it's framework agnostic. It can be consumed in multiple places. So it really kind of fits that hub and spoke model, both on the importing side and also on the getting data out side of it as well.
So let's jump right in then. What is the Valhalla Content Hub then?
And that's a great question. And really, it's good to take a step back and think about what Gatsby was really good at. So Gatsby, the framework, really had this build process where it generated content from multiple CMSs. You could use source plugins and pull in data from Drupal, from WordPress, from Contentful. And a lot of times, as you worked with larger organizations, they didn't just have data in one place. So they would have multiple source plugins when they're building their Gatsby sites. They might connect to 2 or 3 different data sources. Some of them, maybe it's, some kind of legacy system that they, bespoke system that they need to integrate with. So they build a source plugin. Then they might have Drupal, or they might have, Contentful for their, part of their blog, but their landing pages are built in Drupal. And so they'd have a couple different source plugins that would come in. And the benefits of Gatsby is you have this data layer. And then you can access all of those pieces of content through one kind of consolidated GraphQL API. So then you're essentially using a GraphQL API to build out the pages of your site, and you're able to consume data from a lot of different places without ever having to really understand the APIs that you're dealing with, because just the source plugin is in charge of dealing with the APIs. So you don't have to learn the APIs as the front end developer to use the data. You just need to learn GraphQL. And what we realized is that's not a Gatsby specific problem. That's a website development problem. If you're building a modern website today and you're working with large organizations that have data spread across multiple points, you might need this concept of being able to pull all the data in and then let your front end developers just access that through a GraphQL API and build the website without ever having to learn some legacy inventory system that it needs to serve some e-commerce data, and then Drupal's JSON API, and then Contentful's REST or GraphQL API. So you learn one technology, but you can kind of consume data from a lot of different points just by putting together source plugins within Gatsby. So Valhalla is really built on the data layer of Gatsby. That is at the core what powers Valhalla.
Okay, so you're essentially taking something that was just core to GraphQL, abstracting it a bit, and then adding some magic to make it more scalable, right? And a service.
So that is a big part of it. But one thing that Gatsby does really well is we call it internally, we call it delta syncing, but it's the ability for, if you think about it, when you're syncing content from a lot of different places, you don't want to sync a million articles over at one time, right? So you of course have to do that initial sync, but then what happens every time an article changes or every time someone goes back to the original CMS and makes that change? And Gatsby's very good because at actually doing that incremental build is what we had originally built it for with Gatsby, but that incremental or delta data fetching that only happens between, small changes that are going out every day. Because if you are a content editor, you do want to make sure that if you change something in your CMS, you don't have to wait for a long sync process for it to get to your Content Hub and then have it show up on your website. You want that to be instant. And that's what Valhalla does. That's one of the things Valhalla does really well.
Okay.
So to me, and I could be totally wrong here, right? But it seems like it's like almost like a content normalizer, right? Like it's taking content from a whole bunch of places, normalizing it, and then allowing people to kind of get to it from a bunch of different places, right? Can we get into a little bit more detail about how it works exactly? So like in my head, and I'm imagining like, you have Valhalla sitting in your architecture, right? And it has like almost like Drupal modules in it where it can go out and connect to different services and pull content in. And then it does like its magic, normalizes that content, and then allows you to get to it from GraphQL. Like, is that the right idea, or did I just like totally bastardize the system?
Yeah, and I'll just add a little more depth of GraphQL. I mean, were you throwing that word around, and some people might not even know what it is. And I just want to be clear, like I'll give my little quick definition, and there's a piece of it that always stood out. GraphQL just allows you to query data and get back exactly what the data you need in a very simple way, and Facebook built it. But there's this part of GraphQL that blew me away with stitching, data stitching, which is this idea of taking multiple pieces of data and stitching it together so that when someone does it, it's like a join between two different database tables or APIs. And I'm wondering where Valhalla fits into that. Is it leveraging that type of technology? GraphQL data stitching, adding to John, just.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let's go with, we'll start with talking through John's question, and then we'll go into the actual GraphQL, because that's a great point. Not everyone, if you're not using GraphQL right now, it sounds pretty scary, and it's meant to be pretty simple, but we'll talk about that. The first thing is, if you think about what Valhalla is, let's look at an example. I think that's usually the easiest way. Let's say you have a Drupal site today, and maybe you have a bunch of different pieces or areas of content. Maybe it's not just Drupal, but let's just assume for simplicity's sake, you have a Drupal site. How would you get data out of Drupal into Valhalla? Well, when you spin up Valhalla, you can install essentially a Gatsby source plugin. And this Gatsby source plugin is called Gatsby Source Drupal. And over time, like maybe they'll be called Valhalla source plugins. We don't know, but it's essentially a Gatsby source plugin that's powering this. And what it does is it connects to Drupal's JSON API. And the first thing it does is it essentially would sync all the data from your Drupal site. And you have like a one-to-one replica of content in both places. And then as you make changes in Drupal, webhooks will go to Valhalla and say, hey, something new has changed. And it doesn't tell you what changed. It just says something new's changed. So Valhalla is going to reach out to the Drupal site and say, give me the log of entities that have changed since that time. And it gets that delta sync, or that, the JSON that has just changed since the last time that Valhalla has synced data. So you could be calling this every 5 seconds, every 2 hours, once a week, and it's just going to get data from the last time it's actually done a successful sync. And
So it's like
it's
it's like our sync for content.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to describe it. Yeah, you're essentially just syncing what's changed since the last time you synced. And that's how incremental builds is really built within Gatsby. And that's how this kind of incremental data fetching is built within Valhalla. So it allows you to have, a lot of content editors editing content in Drupal, and these webhooks are firing off, and it's just syncing what's changing over time rather than having to do kind of that massive full sync, especially if you've got a lot of content that can take, potentially a fairly large amount of time. Once the data is all in Valhalla, then that's where we kind of get to it's in a centralized database, and then you have a GraphQL API to access that data. And as Jacob was saying, what is GraphQL? How do we explain it to those who maybe haven't used it? I always like to, and this is a bad analogy, but it's if you've ever used like SQL to access a database, GraphQL is like it's different syntax, of course, but it's like SQL but for accessing a API. So you're kind of like getting data from a database in the same way, but it's really a special syntax where you can kind of stitch data from a lot of different places, as Jacob said. But really, where if you were interacting with an API before with maybe REST, you might have to make 3 or 4 REST calls to get all the data you need. GraphQL, you can send one query with all the data, maybe spanning a bunch of different, for instance, in Drupal, a bunch of different entities. If you were going to use Drupal's JSON API and pull a bunch of different entities, different entity types that maybe weren't even related at all, you would have to make multiple calls. Where in GraphQL, you could send one query with a whole bunch of different entity types that weren't connected, and you could get all that data back at one time. So it kind of simplifies the handshake between an API interface and getting the data back from the database. As far as if Valhalla is really using the data stitching, you definitely could use that if you had another API, but since it's already one centralized database, we're already syncing the content. It's essentially just providing you that simplified interface to get the data out of kind of that centralized content hub or content repository, however you want to look at that, how all that content is stored.
So the next question before I get there, I like the analogy of it's like GraphQL is like SQL, because it's not a bad one, because it's an age-old technology. We all know it. We use it. It's been around for a long time. And if you look at the syntax of GraphQL, it's actually a lot nicer than SQL. Like the nuance, it's easier to understand, and it's more readable by humans. And occasionally when you get into SQL, you're like, I don't understand this join. It's so complicated. So let's say we're not doing the data stitching. We're bringing in, I'll give an example, like an organization has 5 or 6 Drupal sites, and they all have blog posts, but they do things a little differently. Like they have an old Drupal 7 site that they haven't updated, and they have a Drupal 9 site, and they're writing blog posts, and we're bringing that data into Valhalla Content Hub. Let's say their fields don't match. Is there a way to massage the data as it's come? So you can call both sites and get the data. Is there a way to massage the data? Where would massaging the data or normalizing it come into play in this process?
And this is where it being built on Gatsby's data layer really starts to shine, because Gatsby for a long time has had something called schema customization. And we have schema customization APIs, which essentially means we know you're going to pull data in, but you might need to customize how that data ends up in the schema. And the schema is, a GraphQL schema is essentially a listing of all the different fields and connections that happen within your within your content or within your database. And so what schema customization allows you to do is you could say, let's use a real world example that sometimes comes up. Let's say you are building an e-commerce site and you're using Drupal for all of the content of your site. However, you have products in Shopify, and you want to use Shopify because maybe the marketing team picked it or whatever, you know that you need to kind of stitch that data together. Well, you want your content to come from Drupal, but you may have relationships between those products that you're going to need to say these two pieces of content are related. And so you could pull data in from Drupal and you could say, well, if this ID is present in this field, it actually links to this specific part of the this product that's available through Shopify. And now you can query that data all at one time. And you can say, give me the content from Drupal for this product, give me the content or the actual e-commerce data from Shopify. And you could build, more of a kind of like a structured content around those two different data points. But you'd have to do a little bit of schema customization to, during that process, that import of saying how those relationships are actually built.
Can you kind of building on that, can you build source dependencies? So for example, if in Jacob's example, you have an old Drupal 7 site and a newer Drupal 9 site, and you've got Shopify. The Drupal 9 site that schema might depend on information from Drupal 7. Can you say, hey, the Drupal 7 stuff has to come in first, then the Drupal 9 stuff, then Shopify? Or is it kind of just whatever
the way
gets changed gets put in first?
So the way that it would work is the data could come in, and every time new data comes in, it'll rebuild those relationships. So if the data came first that didn't have the related content, but then that content came in, those relationships would then be rebuilt. So you'd have them going forward. Technically, you can't really control this data has to be there. But on the front end, you could make sure that that data existed before you built the page, for instance. So you could say, if the Shopify data isn't there, but the Drupal data is, don't build this page because, in whatever front end framework you're using, you could just check you would query the field and say, well, this is returning an empty result. We don't want to build a page for this because the data for some reason is not all complete.
Okay. So it sounds pretty cool, but it's good to ask this question anyway. What benefit does this provide? Why did this be? Why did Gatsby/Netlify decide to move this out of Gatsby General and make a product out of it? What's the main value add?
The biggest value add is if you are if you have a larger amount of web properties, if you have a larger kind of store of content that comes from different places, if you are an enterprise, maybe working towards a larger migration effort, maybe you have a legacy CMS system and you want to do more of a modernization, and you can move some of your content now, but you know that you still have to use those old systems. Building a source plugin is maybe easier than trying to migrate all your content out of it, because there might be a lot of other departments that depend on those systems being there. And if you're using one of those old systems, it might not have an API that's scalable. It might not be able to actually handle web traffic. So it's an ability for you to get some of that legacy content out, as well as connect it to more modern CMSs, connect it to WordPress, Drupal, wherever your data is currently stored. And so we really see the need, if you're building a simple website, a simple, marketing website for your agency, for instance, if I used to run an agency, I would never probably have a need for Valhalla. However, if I was an organization with, I was a large university with 5 different campus departments that all have websites that have contents across a bunch of different CMS systems. Well, now it maybe is the more compelling, because we can get all our content in one place, provide that API to all the services across campus, and they can use that one API to get their content out for their websites. So there are it's certainly targeted towards larger companies that have diverse content needs. And there are other solutions that try to do similar things. But I think what's unique about what we do is that we kind of have it built towards those content editors in mind, right? It's good for developers, makes a great developer experience, but built on kind of that incremental data fetching, data syncing, it allows it to be really real time for content editors. So you can preview and publish without having to, sometimes when you choose to move towards more modern website technologies, you feel like you're kind of moving away from some of the things that you've grown to love. If you're using a different decoupled front end from where you're hosting your CMS, you sometimes lose like that live preview experience that you have. or the feeling that when you publish, you have to wait for some kind of build process to go, and you don't know when that's actually going to be published. And if you're using Drupal or WordPress today, right, you click the button when the page might take a while to save, but when it saves, you know for a fact that it's there. I mean, of course, maybe you don't because there's caching and things like that, but you at least get the sense that it's there. And that becomes
So it sounds like it's also helpful, and again, this is a large organization type issue usually, but it sounds like it's helpful in the situation you're in right now, which is acquisitions, right? So if a company is acquired and the parent company is using Valhalla, rather than having to like integrate with those legacy systems or the systems that the company is using, they can just integrate that content with Valhalla, and then it's available to whatever development teams are producing or developing front end applications. So it can help kind of normalize that data, and it sounds like you could actually use that as a migration aid too. Like you build a source plugin to import it, and then once it's in Valhalla, you pull it out into a more modern, backend system. If somebody's using Drupal 6, Drupal 7, you get that in Valhalla. You already have a way to grab that data. You can just migrate it in.
Yeah, so I think it's probably like a little bit of a level setter, right? And what I guess what I mean by that is like it allows for a single point of connection to your content, right? And your content can be distributed over a bunch of systems. One thing I wanted to ask or understand better is earlier I said it's like a normalizer, but is it actually doing any like normalization? Like, is it standardizing your content at all? Or is it simply just aggregating it so that it could be queried against? So like what I mean there is like, if like say we have a content type in Drupal, right? And it's like, I don't know, we'll use a form, right? So we have a form in Drupal or a user profile in Drupal. Let's go with that one. And like you have first name, last name, company, right? And like you pull that into Valhalla and you say, hey, I want a person's profile, right? And first name, last name, and company are coming from Drupal, but their last purchase, right, is coming from Shopify, right? In Valhalla, you're like, I want first name, last name, and last purchase. We're going to show them like their purchase history on a little card, right? Is it normalizing that data to say like, hey, the profile type has data from all of these services and like, here it is? Or is it more like the developer has to know, okay, I need these 3 pieces from Drupal, this piece from Shopify, this piece from something else to bring it together on, whatever front end application they're developing?
So by default, it's going to take all the data as you have it and organize it into, a GraphQL schema. And if you had the relationships there, as you said on the front end, you could pull all the data that you need to build this user profile.
Okay.
However, you bring up a good point. Maybe you want a specific type called user profile that's made up of data from a bunch of different places. That's where you could use schema customization to say, we're going to create this new type called user profile that doesn't exist in either side. And it's going to be consumed by or fed in data from these 2 different places that make up this user profile to make it easier. The benefits of GraphQL is you don't really need to do that as long as you know how to get the data. But maybe for development reasons, you would want to create a new type and kind of organize your data in that way. It's certainly possible, depending on your needs, to do both.
So that's actually super interesting, and I actually have a great use case that I will share with you guys as soon as I make this point. But like that's super interesting to me because like I think like for an organization that has like a bunch of legacy systems, to have a layer where you can bring all the data in and then kind of build out that schema where you say, okay, like, hey, here's how our new age front end apps are going to connect to this profile, right? Through this schema. We'll always have this information available to them, like kind of like a content type or content mapping in you would have in Drupal, right? I think that provides a really, really powerful resource, and it allows those backend systems to kind of come in and come out like at any point in time, as long as that data is being provided the same way. So use case that I have seen in the past. This was a long time ago before like any of this stuff was hot. It was probably a good 5, maybe 10 years ago at this point. Large hospital organization, right, was rebuilding their intranet, right? And we were going round and round about like features that they wanted to use and like where this data lived. And literally data was everywhere. Like they had Drupal, they had some content in Drupal, they had some content in their HR system, they had some content here. And they wanted to build like an employee directory, right? And that data was in an HR system that was like pretty hard to get to, right? And like this, like if they had back then, right, Valhalla Content Hub, they would have been able to basically connect to Drupal, connect to Valhalla, pull all that information in, and then build their own kind of like React front end app to be able to serve this stuff out and use it however they wanted to, right? So like that seems like pretty powerful to me as far as like a tool that would have allowed them to like, and the biggest reason why we didn't rebuild that HR system was because it was, you know, it was a legacy system. It was integrated into HR. Like it was just too much of a lift, right? But this would have given the opportunity to say like, okay, we're going to integrate with that, pull that data in, and then if that system goes away, we'll address it at a later date, right? So that's pretty interesting, and I don't know, it seems pretty exciting to me now that I understand it better.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add, John, just like this product is more of a strategy too. It's a strategy that you create a central place in your organization that people access content that's normalized, govern. I mean, there's some governance here on what you're exposing in this layer of what's the first name, what's the last name, what are the values, what's the max number of characters.
Yeah.
And it allows for a lot of growth because then it allows all your internal data to move at different paces. It can get upgraded. You know, we brought it up. You can migrate from Drupal 6, 7, 8. I really see a lot of this is a great strategy for large organizations. If you're not that, it's a scale thing. You have to have a lot of data coming in from different places that you don't have. I'll throw it down as if you don't have control of the data like a legacy HR system, this is vital. If you really want to get that data out there.
Yep.
One of the other things you mentioned that's actually a really good use case, and I've seen it didn't exist when I was talking to individuals. So when I was at Gatsby, I spent a lot of time working with companies that were building Gatsby front ends for Drupal backends. You know, I have a lot of experience in Drupal. You know, one of the reasons I'm here, I love Drupal, but you know, sometimes you want a different front end. You don't want to use Drupal's theme engine. You want to use, you know, Gatsby or another framework. In this case, it was always Gatsby. But I've worked with one. It was a larger organization, more of like a government agency type. It wasn't a government agency, but it was parallel to that. And they had a Drupal 7 site, and they were incrementally migrating to Drupal 8. And so part of their site was still Drupal 7, and then, you know, certain paths were served by Drupal 8. And so they had this, you know, they kind of create this Frankenstein monster of effect where, you know, different parts are served by different areas, where if you could replace the front end and you could say some of this content as we migrate over is going to be served by Drupal 8 on these paths. Mm-hmm. Some of this content we're just going to essentially use from Drupal 7 as is, you know, like some of the content might not be the prettiest, but that's okay because we're kind of, it was an older site. We're going to serve it in those pages, but it's still going to be served by Gatsby. It's just going to pull into Valhalla. Then over time, now there's a little less pressure to migrate everything all at once. We can now migrate, okay, this certain content types are going to migrate over, and now they're going to use the new template, the new pages. And so you can, if you're a large organization, by definition, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of processes. It's difficult to do really large scale migrations. So you might be able to incrementally migrate over time by, you know, choosing a new front end, consolidating on Valhalla for the content, making sure all the systems feed into that. And then over time, you kind of slowly replace old systems with new systems because it becomes much more composable as far as like the back end architecture of where your data actually comes from.
But I wanted to clarify one thing, though, because I'm not sure if this is true or not. So John was just asking about organizing the data on the way out, like kind of creating that, as you said, Shane, customizing the schema, you know, for something. I'm curious if is that just really a performance thing, or is it a convenience thing for developers? Like so say taking the example John gave, you have a user profile, you're pulling data from 5 different systems into that user profile. If you create a schema customization for that, is that providing performance gains because it's kind of processing that information as it comes in versus when you're requesting it? Because my understanding is with GraphQL, you can get all that information anyway, but you're essentially joining a bunch of different things, so it'll be a lot more. It'll be less performant. Is that accurate? Or no?
Performance aside, though, my point really was to like make it easier for front end development teams to like get to the data, right? So like having that ability to say like, hey, if you want a profile, pull this, and then like all of the right without having to care about where that data is coming from in the back end. That was the point I was trying to make there.
To answer your question though, Nick, I think there could be use cases where, if you have really large nested GraphQL queries, you're really joining a lot of different relationships. That could slow down, be slower, especially if you have a lot of data. Like, GraphQL is pretty good about it, but you could definitely run into a situation where if you just reorganize the data a little bit, that would be kind of like, you have a database, but you need to reorganize the schema a little bit. So maybe your data isn't as, I go back to like database days. Maybe some things don't need to be in third normal form or whatever. If you're familiar with like how you really get to like different levels of the database, like that's not always the most performant because you're joining way too many tables. So maybe you just have larger tables of all the data in one place with more columns. And so, it's kind of like that. You could do some of that for performance reasons. It's, I say it's kind of edge casey, but when you're dealing with large organizations, maybe not so edge casey. There are times when you might need to really consider performance of kind of consolidating that data. So I could see it being both.
Okay.
So I have to ask this question. We don't have it in the list, but and John started this rabbit hole. We're talking about user data, right? We're saying we're stitching together user information, and we talk about healthcare, and I work in healthcare, and we start getting into PHI. We're starting to get into, and there's a question about the product of what's the level of privacy or data that could be stored in it and where it's at in that. I mean, for me, is it HIPAA compliant? Has it gone through that process? And yes or no answers are fine for that. We don't have to go down the full rabbit hole, but I think we're talking about this as an enterprise product. So where does it fit into the enterprise? Could it store all data about every user and basically stitch, it's not meant to be a CDP, but you're getting close to that level of data potentially.
Yeah. Well, so the answer is not today. So it hasn't gone through that process. Long term, I don't know where if that's it's not on the near term roadmap as far as use cases, but it is targeted towards the enterprise. I could see a path for us eventually getting there. However, when we look at what it really serves, it really serves that web developer market where you're taking data and you're providing it to end users. It's not really, there are other solutions that really do well for building apps off of it, and you certainly could. But if you're primarily building a really interactive app, maybe Valhalla is not the best choice. There are others out there that might serve you slightly better. If you're building a website with data from a bunch of different places, Valhalla might be the best choice.
So I just want to clarify something that you said, Jacob. CDP, is that consumer data platform?
Yeah, consumer data platform. So the example is I'm talking about user data, and that's a platform where you store your patient data. If you were talking about healthcare, you'd centralize it there. Thank you for calling me on that acronym.
I looked it up, and there was a bunch of FEMA disaster preparedness things.
Yeah, it's not a great acronym, but I'm in the thick of it, so we use it every day.
So, Shane, is anybody? Sorry, I was going to say, is anybody using this? But are there any production examples of, Valhalla in the wild that you could share, or any industries that are kind of gravitating towards this?
So what I can share is that we're using Valhalla, different pieces of Valhalla on the GatsbyJS.com website today. So Valhalla is used in, certain parts of it are used in production right there on, kind of that Gatsby.js site. However, we have a number of customers I can't say the names of yet that are using it. And, it's one of those things that's been out for a little while. We've really rolled it out into kind of like an early access where, you had to kind of come to us with your use case and we'd work with you to make sure it works for your needs. We have a lot of people that are, I would say, kicking the tires in that they have the idea for it. They're starting to implement it, integrate it, but it's not ready for them to flip the switch to actually turn it on in production yet. There's kind of a couple different parts of Valhalla, and some of those I would say are in production and being used by some of these organizations, but kind of like the broader roadmap of where they want to get with it, I wouldn't say anyone's really completely productionized besides, using it in, like I said, in the GatsbyJS.com website, which we're using it today.
So I'm going to throw out another term here that I think might have come from your presentation at NetCamp last November. Which is Content Lake. And Content Lake is kind of like a data lake. All the stuff kind of lives there in a soup, and you can kind of pull what you need to out of it. And for a Content Lake to be useful, it has to be structured, as we've discussed. And you can structure it, as you've already said. You can structure it by how you query it. You can structure it on the import side, from the plugins. But I'm curious about that process. Is setting up a source plugin for Valhalla purely a development task where you have to kind of map pieces individually, or is there some sort of UI, kind of like if you go back to Drupal 7, feeds and feeds tamper is kind of what I think of. Like with feeds, you say like, hey, this is the source I'm looking at. And then feeds tamper, you might say, oh, this date is in, year, month, date, and I want it to be in timestamp form. And this is, lowercase, but I want it to be title case or something, right? Are there plans to do that? Does Valhalla already do that? Can I set up a Valhalla and be like, this is a Drupal site, and then have it do a JSON pull and then say, okay, I want this value to be modified this way? Or is it purely a developer is doing that?
Right now, it's definitely a developer task to do that, whether you're connecting to a new source or if you really wanted to modify data that came in. At the end of the day, it's JavaScript, so it's not the most complicated of developer tasks, but it is still a developer task. There's not a clean UI. We've certainly talked about how a UI might look for some of those things, but it has never really been seriously explored yet.
There are other Content Hub solutions on the market. How do you think Valhalla compares to those? Or maybe a better question, how do you think Valhalla is better than some of those other solutions?
Yeah, there are a lot of solutions. I know, if you're looking at solutions specifically to connect a bunch of different APIs together, there are solutions for that. And so there's kind of it's a whole big space, right? And at the end of the day, you could take 20 different examples and we overlap in small ways. I don't know that there's a lot that overlap exactly with what we're doing, of course. And that's, I think, a good thing, right? Is everyone has their own slight differentiation depending on what you need. Valhalla isn't probably the best if you're trying to build strictly just an app without, a lot of front end content. Valhalla is really built for kind of this, what was originally called, and I'll use some kind of Netlify terminology that they really started. If you've heard of the term Jamstack, that was really kind of coined by Netlify to be, JavaScript, APIs, and, markup. So you have, you kind of creating a front end site from back end APIs is really what started as the Jamstack, but it's really become more than that. And so the term we're really using now is composable, and creating composable architectures where you have kind of composable backends, composable front ends, and you want to kind of be able to make the best choice rather than kind of just like accepting an all-in solution. So you can kind of pick what backend makes the most sense for you, what front end makes the most sense for your team based on, your team dynamics. And I think when you're choosing to go towards that route, that's where Valhalla really is a great example of what you can do. And that's where I think we really win compared to some of the other alternatives, is that it was really built for that. Pick your back end, pick your front end. You're going to use some kind of, JavaScript front end framework, whether it's Next.js or Gatsby or Remix or Astro, and you want to be able to stitch all that stuff together. I think that's the where Valhalla really has the advantage. There are other competitors that do slightly different things that serve maybe slightly different niches, but that's where we're really focused. Is you're building you're building a front end website that you want, hundreds or, hopefully millions of people to see, and you want to pull content from a couple different places, Valhalla is a good answer for you to be able to, whether it's modernize your effort, connect different disparate content systems together, all in one place.
So just to clarify, because I had this question and maybe our thought, and maybe our listeners do too, Valhalla isn't accepting, like, you can't from your front end, you can't send content to Valhalla, right? Like it's kind of like a one direction sort of thing. It's not like if you had a web form on your front end, you could store that web form data within Valhalla.
Today, that's correct.
Okay.
John, that goes back to composable.
Whoa.
Wait.
Was that a look into the future? Today,
well,
that's
no.
correct.
Well, maybe it is, but just to throw it out there, composable means like you have your one system that does one thing really, really well. Valhalla takes the data and distributes the data. For data coming in from a website, maybe it's CDP, maybe it's a different product. Like it's a really interesting. You want to, you want to compose the right tool for the right job. So I never would expect Valhalla to be doing that. It's meant to orchestrate content going out.
I didn't really expect that either. I was just wanted to clarify, because I'm like in my head, I'm also thinking in some setups like Valhalla could be a Drupal replacement, because in a lot of instances, right, that's how you're using Drupal, as like, hey, let me bring all of these systems together, bring all this content together in one place, right, and then like put it out to my headless front end via an API, right? So like, if that's like your use case for Drupal, maybe Valhalla replaces that in some instances. I don't know.
Well, one thing I've seen in that use case with Drupal, where Drupal's bringing in data, is sometimes you put like, let me see if I can give a concrete example. You're bringing in some news article from some other site. It's legacy, it's old, and you need to massage that data, not programmatically, editorially. Like you need someone to read that data. Like I deal with this where we'll get a clinical trial that's written by a researcher, and we need to take that and add a layer on top of it that's more for the public. And that's where Drupal kind of shines, because we can bring that data in, have someone preview it, add that extra piece of information, and then send it off. Valhalla's not really doing any content. It's not a content authoring tool. I mean, it's a content hub or aggregation. By the way, that word seems to be accurate. It's a tool to aggregate your content and distribute it. The next question, you started to hit the answer, and I think it's still a really important question to emphasize to people, that this product, do you have to use Gatsby with this product? I think you've said you don't. It's agnostic. It's front-end agnostic, which is huge. And I will throw out there, it distinguishes it from other content hubs I've seen, just to throw it out there, like the three big CMSs, Acquia, Sitecore, and Adobe all have products. And my experience with Acquia and Sitecore was they're pretty tightly coupled to their product, meaning it was meant to bring content in and push it out to other instances of Drupal or Sitecore. And this doesn't feel like it's driven that way. And Gatsby feels like it's an option.
So today you technically need a Gatsby site, but that site doesn't have to have any front end on it. So you would still need to configure a Gatsby site the way that you typically do. And on Gatsby Cloud today, if you're using Valhalla, it's connected to your Gatsby site. And again, you don't need to use the Gatsby front end. You're just maybe using the API portion of it. One of the things that we're looking to do as we bring this to Netlify is reimagine it. So even though, under the hood, there's still technically going to be parts of Gatsby building the data layer of this. You'll never have to know that Gatsby is even there. You'll get the API without ever having to interact with Gatsby in any way. Yeah. So Valhalla becomes a separate product. And then, either way, today you can still use any front end you want alongside of it. Technically, you still have this Gatsby site that's there, but long term that kind of goes away as well.
Well, then the follow up is when you have that Gatsby, the source plugins. I've heard that term with Gatsby that existed before this product. Is that accurate?
Yes. So Gatsby has a plugin ecosystem, just like Drupal has a module ecosystem, and a lot of it's community driven. Some of it is we maintain. Gatsby would maintain some of the kind of marquee source plugins, and there are different plugins that do other things. But main one that Valhalla uses are these things called source plugins. And source just means you're sourcing content from somewhere, whether that's Google Sheets. There's a very common source plugin that people use to source data from Google Sheets, or it's Drupal, right? You know, you're sourcing from a CMS, and that's the other common use case. And so these source plugins are just written in JavaScript. They're tools to go out and get content from an API or somewhere, pull it into kind of the centralized database. And that's what Gatsby did really well. And that's what built Gatsby's data layer, which then of course became what Valhalla is.
So you mentioned that earlier in the show that there's webhooks in Valhalla that will, like, if somebody updates the source data, a webhook will fire, Valhalla will go get that data. And you've mentioned the Delta builds and that things do partial builds, but do those webhooks go the other way too? Like, is there a way, if Valhalla is updated, that whatever is using, if Gatsby is using Valhalla as its source, will it automatically build and push that content out, or is it still kind of a manual thing?
So I don't know if I fully understand, but I guess I'll tell you a little bit about kind of how it works, and then that might answer the question. So when the data comes in, that kicks off a sync process, right? Sources, it gets the Delta changes from, let's say, Drupal, pulls in what's changed, it syncs it out to the API. And then also, if you think about, let's say you're using it with Gatsby, Gatsby is a static by default site generator. So there's a webhook that's going to trigger to Gatsby to say, you need to rebuild. Yeah. And so that webhook doesn't need to be pointed at a Gatsby site. That webhook could go somewhere else where you need it to build the Next.js site, or to build, something else, or to trigger, if you wanted to send a webhook back every time there was a Valhalla sync, you wanted to, send a webhook back to Drupal because you might want to just see what, run a query and see what's changed or something. There's possibilities to do that. Of course, I haven't seen any ruled examples where you'd need to do it, but I imagine when you get into some of these more complex use cases, things like that are going to happen, and you're going to need to be able to see that something was synced, something changed. Okay, well, let's interact with it in some way.
So a use case I think of there, and this might be like absolutely bananas, but like I see it like almost like in the examples we've used so far, like a lot of legacy systems, a lot of like stuff, right? We want to kind of like normalize that data or normalize that content, group it into one spot, right? Make it easier for developers to ingest. Like I almost see like, if we were using Valhalla to do that for the legacy systems, right? Maybe Drupal ingesting the Valhalla data, right? And using Drupal as a content layout tool, right? So like, and I imagine like Valhalla content being populated into a block, and then somebody being able to take that block off of out of the tray and put it into Layout Builder, and then build pages with it on a front end of some sort. Maybe it's headless, maybe it's Drupal front end, who knows? But like, I see that as possibly being one use case for that workflow. So I can see that kind of being useful. So it sounds like that could be possible if you wanted to do something like that.
Yeah, it depending on the use case, whether that would make the most sense for what you're building. But yeah, I could definitely see if content needed to come from multiple places, and you wanted to use Drupal as your front end, and you want to use Layout Builder, you could certainly, just like you could in, with a Gatsby front end or a Next.js front end, you could do a very similar thing. And then once it was in Drupal, you could structure it and, editorialize, as kind of Jacob said, like maybe you need to change the data a little bit. You could do that within Drupal. So certainly, I think that'd be pretty complicated to build, but I do think it would certainly be possible.
So you've explicitly stated this works with Drupal and it kind of uses the JSON API for that. But can you talk a little bit about those details? Is it one of those things where Drupal has such a close integration with Gatsby that you kind of just install that source plugin, enable JSON API, and your data is there? Or do you still have to do some work there?
It's pretty simple. Right now you need a Gatsby.
Sorry, assuming you don't have to do any of that massaging. Like assuming you just want the data in.
Assuming you just want to get data in, essentially what it would be is, as I said, you still need a Gatsby site today. That might, eventually you'll be able to click this from a UI or have a not necessarily need to have the concept of a Gatsby site, but you install that Gatsby source Drupal source plugin and you point it at your Drupal site. In Drupal, you turn on JSON API, then your data's there. Now, if you want the performance of like this incremental data fetching, there's a Drupal module called Gatsby that you would need to install and just configure in Drupal's admin UI to tell it, these are the content types or entity types I care about. Here's what I want to sync. And once you do that, then yeah, all the incremental stuff happens as well. So getting data out, just turn on JSON API, configure a Gatsby site to pull it in, and you can turn that Gatsby site into, you basically, in Gatsby Cloud today, you would upload it to Gatsby Cloud or connect your Gatsby site, and you just have, you turn on Valhalla and you have it. It's your, it shows anytime you make changes to that content that you care about in Drupal, it'll sync over. And you'll see that data has synced over from Drupal. Here's the URL to get to your GraphQL API, and you can get all the data from there.
And there are a couple more questions. One of them, since I'm the performance guy, I guess, on this podcast. What is the type? We're talking about legacy systems in general here for Valhalla, right? Which sometimes have a lot of data and a lot of different sources. How, not talking about these incremental ones, but like an initial sync, or if we need to do a full resync, for example, if we have a site that has 20,000 pages, 50,000 pages, what kind of timeline are we looking at for a sync? Is it an hour? Is it 10 hours? Is it 3 weeks? Like what's some kind of baseline that we can think of if we're looking to sync something initially?
Yeah. So as an example, we have a site that has over 100,000 articles, 100,000 pages. That might take if you had to do a clean sync, that might take an hour, right? To sync all that data over. Now, after that sync incrementally, you might have 5 to 10 seconds if you change data. So in 5 seconds, your data can go from saved in Drupal to live on an API. It depends on the queries you run and all that, but there's definitely this idea of it's relatively quick for those content edits. The content editor doesn't want to wait 50 seconds or 30 seconds, so it needs to be pretty fast.
Absolutely.
Okay, Shane, I'm ready to sign up. I wanna move all my content to Valhalla. What is Valhalla going to cost me? What's the cost model, pricing structure here?
Well, I would recommend you get in touch with one of our salespeople, and we will talk through your needs. It is an I'm joking, but I'm also serious in a way as well, because it really depends on all sites are different. The amount of content you have is different. The amount of load on the API, as far as like how many people are actually going to use this thing, what kind of bandwidth are you using? There's a lot of factors that would factor into that. It is built for enterprises. It's an enterprise product. So it's one of those things you're not just going to be able to self-serve buy without talking to someone on our team to figure out what is it that that your site's going to do, that your use case is going to be, and then that would factor into the price quite a bit.
So you can't even give us a range. It's very much you have.
Okay. Well, come on.
It's that enterprise that you have to.
If you're asking, yeah, it's the range could be, a small amount to a very large amount.
Exactly.
Let's stay there.
Let's six-figure amount.
But I think, let's step back and just say, what's the process? Like, is there a public preview for developer? Is there a preview for developers? What's the support? I mean, maybe not even pricing, but just talking about support process, like
validating.
How do we? I mean, it's almost like, how do we sign up, and what's the process for going live with the product? And that's outside of pricing. That's just the onboarding of getting a team involved.
Yes, and we can talk through that. So the way it would work today, and again, some of this stuff is still in transition as we're really figuring out, what does Valhalla look like with Netlify? How do we take the best parts of Valhalla and the best parts of Netlify's platform and make sure that we're building a product that's going to be better than what Gatsby could have done on our own, right? Because Netlify has a lot of resources that Gatsby didn't have access to. And so that's one of the things we're really excited about, is what the next, I'm not even going to say 6 month, what the next 2 to 3 month future really looks like. and how do we get there. But today, you could easily get an enterprise trial on Gatsby. We'd walk through, we'd talk about your use case with you, we'd get you spun up. Obviously, just because it's a trial, doesn't mean you're gonna ever have to pay anything. So you get to evaluate it, you get to try it out, see if it fits your use case. We have some public videos and demos that are showing how it works, so you can kind of at least do an entry level validation of if you think it's going to solve your problems or not before even talking to a salesperson. Because I know that once you feel like you start talking to sales, you need to be pretty committed to it. So those would be the what we have today. I think in the future we'll have a lot more.
I was just going to ask Shane if we were going to see him at DrupalCon.
Still not sure yet. Maybe. Oh, I hope so.
Well, I hope so too.
Well, Shane, it's been a pleasure having you back on the show. I've been looking forward to this since I saw your talk at NetCamp about, 6 months ago now. It's definitely an interesting product, and glad to have you back.
Yeah, it's always exciting to be back, and I'm sure I'll talk to you all again at some point in the somewhat near future.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing become a patron. Okay, Shane, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, had some questions about Valhalla, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
The best way to get in touch with me is probably through Twitter, smthomas3 on Twitter. I would say that's the best. You could probably guess my email at netlify first.last name, and you could get that as well if you had something a little more detailed you wanted to talk about.
And Jacob, how about you?
Everywhere I am Jay Rockowitz, on Twitter, on Drupal.org, on my website.com. There's a contact form there, and you can always catch me on Drupal Slack, and the same handle is being used there. Thanks.
And how about you, John?
Before I sign off here, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Florida Drupal Camp. I came back from Florida Drupal Camp this past weekend, and it was great. And the organizers, volunteers, attendees, speakers down there were all awesome. So good job, Florida Drupal Camp. And you can actually look for my talk at Florida Drupal Camp on the website. The slides and the video will be up there soon. So for me, you can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and including Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.